trailer smelled like rot and broken promises. Josie had known that before she signed the paper, had known at the moment the landlord slid the key across the table without meeting her eyes. The way people look away from things they're ashamed to take money for. The key was cold. The paper was damp at the corners. She signed anyway because there was nowhere else to go. And because 23 years of being an omega in a world built for alphas had taught her one thing above everything else. You take what is offered before it's taken back. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself a lot of things that autumn. The trailer sat at the far edge of Ashford territory. Past the tree line where the pines grew close enough to block the afternoon light. Past the old mill road that nobody used anymore. Past the stone marker that said end of packlands in letters so weathered they were barely legible. It was a half-hour walk from the nearest house. The nearest house belonged to a widow who kept her curtains drawn and her opinion of omegas firmly to herself. Nobody came this far unless they were lost or hunting. Josie was neither. She was simply out of options. The first night she sat on the floor because the only chair had one leg shorter than the others and tilted at an angle that made her feel like the world itself was leaning away from her. The floor was cold linoleum cracked at the seams, and she wrapped herself in the single wool blanket she'd brought from the room she used to rent above the baker's shop in town. That room had been small and damp, too, but it had smelled of bread and yeast and the particular warmth of a building that housed living things. The trailer smelled of mildew and the ghost of someone else's cigarettes, and something beneath both of those things. A deep structural decay, like wood slowly becoming something other than wood. She didn't cry. She had cried 3 months ago, when the Ashford Pack Council had formally stripped her of the last remnant of her mother's estate. She had cried 2 months ago when the appeal was rejected without a hearing. She had cried 6 weeks ago, when she found out why the appeal had been rejected. When she found out who had written the letter that preceded it, who had made the phone call that mattered, who had smiled at her across the dinner table every Sunday for 14 years. And called her daughter while quietly methodically dismantling everything her mother had left behind. Her stepfather, Edmund Voss, pack elder, respected man, liar with patient hands. She hadn't cried since. There was something that happened to grief when it ran out of softness. It didn't disappear. It hardened. It became something dense and quiet that lived behind her sternum and pressed outward whenever she breathed too deeply, reminding her it was still there, reminding her it had nowhere to go. Yet, she breathed shallowly most of the time now. The trailer had 3 things wrong with it that the landlord had not mentioned. The window above the sink did not close all the way, which meant that on nights when the wind moved through the pines, with any intention cold air crept in along the edge of the frame and settled against the back of her neck like a warning. The water that came from the tap ran brown for the first minute before clearing to something she told herself was acceptable. And the floorboard nearest the door, the one she stepped on first every morning when she got up before dawn to make the walk into town for work, gave a sound like a small animal in pain each time her weight hit it. She named it eventually. The floorboard. She called it Edmund. It helped in the way that small and slightly unhinged coping strategies sometimes help. She worked at the apothecary in town, grinding herbs and preparing tinctures for Marta, who was 64 and had bad knees. And had hired Josie because, as she'd said plainly on the day of the interview, "You're an omega and you won't try to impress me. And that's exactly what I need." It was not a compliment. Josie had taken it as one anyway. She was paid in coin and occasionally in leftover supplies, dried lavender, rosehip oil, small bundles of sage, and she was paid just enough to afford the trailer. A bag of flour, dried lentils, and one extravagance per week that she permitted herself without guilt. Some weeks it was a candle, some weeks it was a small jar of honey, some weeks it was nothing, because some weeks the coin ran short, and extravagance was a concept belonging to another life. She did not have a wolf. That was the thing people said quietly when they spoke about her. The Voss girl, the omega, the one without a wolf, as if her name were a condition, as if the absence of a wolf spirit made her less real, less solid, like a figure in a painting that hasn't been fully filled in yet. Her wolf had been silent since she was 17, gone quiet in a way the pack healers called suppressed and the pack elders called defective, and Edmund had called once in a moment of particular cruelty convenient. She had not understood what he meant by that until much later. She understood now. It was the end of October when she found the box. She had been trying to fix the window, had borrowed a hammer and a small piece of tin from the mill road, intending to bend it into something that might hold the frame shut against the wind, and in pulling at the rotted wood beneath the sill her fingers had found a hollow. Not rot, a deliberate hollow, sealed with a piece of fitted wood that had been cut carefully and placed carefully and hidden carefully by someone who had lived here before her and wanted something kept. She almost left it alone. Almost. Inside the hollow was a box no larger than her 2 hands together. Cedar, bound with a strip of leather. Inside the box a folded letter. A small stoppered vial of something dark, and a pressed flower so old it had gone translucent, the color of old parchment. The shape of something she couldn't immediately name. The letter was not addressed to her. It was addressed to the one the Voss family sends away. Her hands went very still. The letter was written in a hand she did not recognize. Tight, deliberate script pressed hard into the paper as if the writer had needed the words to stay. She read it once. Then she read it again. Slowly. The way you read something when the first reading makes no sense, and you're hoping the second will reveal that you misunderstood. The second reading did not improve things. The letter said that the trailer was not a coincidence, that the land it sat on was not worthless pack outskirts, that the stone marker at the edge of the territory was not a boundary. It was a cover. That beneath this specific strip of earth running from the tree line to the creek bed 40 yards east, there were documents sealed in iron casing that had been buried by a pack archivist 22 years ago at the request of a woman named Clara Voss, her mother. The letter said that Clara had known what Edmund was before she married him, and had married him anyway, because she believed she could outmaneuver him, that she had been wrong. That before she died, and the letter used the word before with a weight that made Josie's vision blur at the edges. She had hidden the proof of what Edmund had done, what he had stolen, not just the estate, not just the money, something older than both. The letter ended with 6 words. Your wolf is not gone, he took her. The vial slipped from Josie's fingers and hit the floor and did not break, rolling slowly to rest against the tilted leg of the chair. The pressed flower remained in her palm. She looked at it for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with sudden violence, and the window frame gave its usual complaint. And somewhere in the deep dark of the trees, something large shifted its weight. She did not recognize it as a wolf. Not yet. She only knew that the thing behind her sternum, the dense, hardened grief she had been carrying for 3 months, had cracked open slightly. And what was leaking out was not sadness. It was fury. It was the specific fury of someone who has just discovered that what they lost was not lost at all. It was taken, deliberately, by someone who smiled across Sunday dinner tables and called it love. Josie closed her hand around the pressed flower. She looked at the hollow in the wall. She started to plan. She did not sleep that night. She sat on the cold linoleum with the letter pressed flat against her knee and the vial recovered from the floor and held carefully between 2 fingers. And she thought with the particular clarity that comes only when fear and fury arrive at the same moment and cancel each other's noise out. The candle she had lit, this week's extravagance, beeswax, the kind that burned clean and long, through a circle of amber light that ended sharply at the edges of the room. And beyond that circle the trailer was all shadow and the sound of wind and the occasional moan of the floorboard settling. She read the letter a 3rd time, and a 4th. The handwriting troubled her in a specific way she couldn't immediately name. It was not her mother's hand. She knew her mother's handwriting the way she knew the smell of the lavender water Clara had kept on her dressing table. The way she knew the sound of her mother's particular laugh, low and sudden and slightly surprised by itself, as if joy still caught her off guard even after years of practice. This was someone else's hand. Someone who had written with urgency, but also with care, as if they'd known the letter might need to survive a long time in a hollow wall. Someone who had known her mother. Someone who had known what Edmund was doing and had not been able to stop it, but had done this, hidden this, left this as the only intervention available to them. She thought about who that person might be. She thought about Nora. Nora had been her mother's closest companion, not a servant, never that, but something older and more complicated. A woman who had arrived in the household before Josie was born and who had disappeared 3 weeks after Clara's death with no explanation offered and no forwarding word left. Edmund had said she'd been let go. Edmund had said a great many things. Josie set the letter down and picked up the vial. The liquid inside was dark, not black, but the deep reddish brown of something that had once been brighter and had aged into this. She unstoppered it carefully and brought it close enough to smell without drinking. Pine resin, iron, something floral underneath, green and faintly bitter. And beneath even that, something she had no name for. Something that moved against the inside of her nose like a sound just below hearing. Her wolf stirred. It was so faint she almost convinced herself she imagined it. A shift, a pressure. Something that had been still for 6 years moving in the dark of her chest like a sleeper turning without waking. She stoppered the vial immediately, hands not entirely steady, and set it on the floor beside her like it was something that needed to be respected before it was touched again. Your wolf is not gone. He took her. She had spent 6 years believing herself broken. 6 years watching other Omegas move through the world with their wolves present and available. That warm animal consciousness sitting alongside their own like a second heartbeat. Clear's throat, 6 years of pack healers and their careful pitying faces and their carefully worded reports that always arrived at the same destination by slightly different routes. Nothing to be done. Some Omegas simply don't manifest. It's not unheard of. She should adjust her expectations. Edmund had been in the room for 3 of those consultations. He had held her hand and looked sorrowful. She thought about that now. His hand over hers, his expression of practiced grief, and the thing behind her sternum pressed so hard against her ribs she had to stand up and walk to the window just to have something to do with the energy of it. Outside, the pines were moving. The wind had settled into the kind of steady, purposeful blow that meant the night had found its rhythm. The moon was not quite full, 3 days off, she guessed. The light it threw through the clouds silver and slightly reluctant. She pressed her palm against the cold glass and watched the tree line. The large shape she had noticed earlier was gone, or it had moved somewhere she couldn't see. In the morning she went to see Marta, not about the herbs, not about the tinctures or the inventory or the order of dried chamomile that was 2 weeks late from the valley supplier. She went to Marta because Marta was 64 and had lived in Ashford territory her entire life and had opinions she kept mostly to herself and a memory that functioned, as she once said, like a ledger. Nothing goes and that doesn't stay. Josie arrived before the shop opened, knocked at the side door, and was let in with the particular look Marta reserved for people who arrived early with difficult faces. She showed her the letter. Marta read it standing at the workbench, her bad knees apparently forgotten, one hand resting on the scarred wood surface as if she needed the steadiness. She read it once, quickly, and then set it down and looked at Josie with an expression that was not surprise. "You knew," Josie said. "I knew something." Marta turned to put the kettle on the hook above the small fire. "Not the details, not enough to be useful. Your mother came to me once about a month before she died. She wanted a specific preparation, something for clarity of thought for a person whose thinking had been made slow." She paused. "I thought at the time she meant herself. Illness does that sometimes, clouds the mind. I gave her what she asked for. She didn't mean herself." "No." Marta's voice was flat and careful. "I don't think she did." The kettle began to breathe. Outside, the town was waking. Josie could hear the smith's apprentice starting up the bellows 2 streets over, the sound of cartwheels on cobblestone, someone calling across a roof. The ordinary sounds of a morning that did not know it was adjacent to something terrible. "The documents the letter mentions," Josie said. "The ones buried on the land. I heard rumors years ago that the old archivist, Pell his name was Harmon Pell, had done something off the record before he left the territory. He moved east, died about 8 years ago." Marta poured the water and pushed one of the cups toward Josie. "If he buried something, nobody found it. Nobody who said so, anyway. I need to find it before Edmund does. Edmund doesn't know about it." "He will." Josie wrapped her hands around the cup. "He had my appeal blocked in 3 days. He is someone on the council watching the apothecary records. I know because the healer who reviewed my suppression case last spring had access to your supply logs, and there's no other reason for that." She watched Marta's expression shift, something tightening at the corners of the old woman's mouth. "He's been watching me, not because I'm a threat, because he wants to make sure I stay manageable. But if he finds out about the hollow in the wall, he'll move first." Marta sat down heavily. "Yes, that's Edmund. I need 2 things." Josie set the cup down. "I need to know if there's anyone left who is loyal to my mother, not to the Voss name, to her, and I need to know about the land, the actual ownership. Because if those documents say what I think they say, it wouldn't just be the estate." Marta was quiet for a moment. "The creek land, Josie. If the boundary marker is false, if the territory line was drawn incorrectly or deliberately incorrectly, the land your trailer sits on isn't Ashford Pact territory at all." She looked up. "It's border land, unclaimed, which means it falls under the jurisdiction of the High Seat." "The High Seat?" Josie went very still. The High Seat was not a place most people in Ashford had reason to think about. It was not local. It was not small. The High Seat was the authority above pack councils, above territory elders, above the entire layered structure of regional governance that Edmund Voss had spent 20 years embedding himself into. The High Seat was the Alpha King's domain. "If the land is border land," Josie said slowly, "then Edmund's claim to my mother's estate, which was tied to the land, is void. More than void. It would be fraudulent seizure of assets within territory that falls outside Ashford jurisdiction." Marta's voice was very quiet. "Which means the council that approved it had no authority to approve it. Which means every ruling they've made about you in the last 3 years is illegitimate." The word came out of Josie's mouth like something she'd been holding underwater finally breaking the surface. All of it. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The fire crackled. The smith's bellows continued their work. The ordinary morning went on being ordinary outside the window, oblivious. "You'd need to bring it to the High Seat directly," Marta said. "Not through the council, not through any channel Edmund can reach directly. I know, the Alpha King doesn't receive petitions from Omegas without a pack in good standing." "I know that too." Marta looked at her for a long moment. "You're going to dig up that land tonight?" "Yes." Another pause. Marta reached under the workbench and produced a small oil lamp and a short-handled spade that had no business being in an apothecary. She set both on the counter without comment. "Take the lamp," she said. "The spade is better than whatever you've got." Josie looked at the old woman, her bad knees, her ledger memory, her opinion of omegas that had never been pity, and felt something loosen in her chest, brief and unexpected, a small private thaw. "Why are you helping me?" Marta picked up her own cup. "Because your mother asked me to give her something for clarity of thought, and I've spent 6 years wondering if I should have asked more questions." She took a sip. "Now go. Come back before the morning crowd, and I'll tell you what else I remember." The ground was harder than she expected. She had waited until the moon climbed high enough to be useful and low enough to be discreet. That particular hour past midnight when the pines stopped moving, and the world contracted into something small and immediate. And the darkness had a texture you could almost press your hand against. She had dressed in her heaviest layers, laced her boots tight, and walked back to the trailer with the oil lamp shuttered to a thin thread of light. The spade over her shoulder. The letter folded inside her coat against her ribs where she could feel it with every breath. The creek bed was 40 yards east of the trailer. She had walked it before. Had followed it on slow evenings when the work was done and the silence of the pine-edged land was the kind that cleaned rather than oppressed. She knew where it bent, where the roots of an old ash tree pushed up through the bank, where the water ran shallow enough to cross in boots without soaking through. She knew this land the way you know a place you've been lonely in, which is to say intimately and with complicated feelings. She started digging near the stone marker. The first foot was clay heavy and cold and came up in reluctant chunks. The second foot was better, darker soil, looser, the kind that had been turned before and remembered it. She found the iron casing at just under 2 ft, her spade hitting it with a sound that was not stone and not root, a flat metallic report that sent a crow lifting from the nearest pine in a sudden black fury of wings. She went still. Listened. Nothing moved in the tree line. She set the spade aside and used her hands for the last of it, clearing the soil from the edges of the casing until she could work her fingers beneath the lip and pull. It came up with the particular resistance of something that has been underground long enough to form an opinion about staying there. Inside, a wrapped oilcloth bundle, dry despite everything, tied with a cord that had once been red and was now the color of old rust. She did not open it there. She covered the hole, replaced the soil as best she could, and carried the bundle back to the trailer with the lamp still shuttered, moving through the dark by memory and the cold certainty of someone who has just changed the shape of their own future. Inside, by candlelight, she unwrapped the oilcloth with hands that were steady in the way that hands are steady when steadiness is a decision rather than a natural state. The documents were 7 in total. 3 were written in the formal script of Pack archival record, land surveys, boundary measurements, the kind of dense official language that existed to be unambiguous. 2 were letters in her mother's hand. 1 was a council record with 3 signatures she recognized and 1 she didn't. And the last was a document she had to read twice before she understood what she was holding. It was a deed, not to the estate, not to the house in the Voss compound where she had grown up, which Edmund had absorbed into his holdings with the smooth efficiency of someone who had been planning it for years. This was a deed to the borderland itself, 36 acres running from the false marker to a natural boundary 3 miles north, registered not under Ashford Pack Authority, but under the High Seats Land Office. Filed 23 years ago in the name of Clara Rain before she became Clara Voss, before she married Edmund. Before she apparently understood that the man she was marrying had identified her land first and pursued her second. Her mother had known eventually. The letters made that clear. The first was written to Nora, to my Nora, the salutation said, and the intimacy of it made Josie's throat tighten in a way she hadn't expected. It laid out, in Clara's careful and slightly formal hand, what she had discovered about Edmund's interest in the borderland. That he had known before their courtship began that the land held something the High Seat would eventually want. A natural corridor between 3 territories, the kind of geographic asset that became politically significant as Pack boundaries shifted, that he had married her to get access to the deed, that by the time she understood this, Josie was 4 years old and the marriage was a structure she couldn't dismantle without leaving her daughter exposed. He cannot take the deed while I live, the letter said. He would need my signature and I will not give it, but I am not well, Nora. And I need you to understand that my unwellness did not arrive on its own. Josie stopped reading, started again. I need you to understand that my unwellness did not arrive on its own. I cannot prove it yet. I am working toward proof and I have asked Harmon to help me secure what I have. If something happens before I finish, take Josie somewhere safe. Do not let Edmund shape her understanding of what I was, and do not let him find the land. The second letter was shorter, written in a hand that was recognizably her mother's, but thinner. The pressure of the pen lighter as if the writer had less weight to put behind the words. It was addressed to Josie directly. My love, if you're reading this, you're already braver than you know, because finding this means you kept asking questions when the world gave you every reason to stop. I'm sorry I couldn't stay long enough to answer them myself. The wolf they told you was missing, she was never gone. Edmund knows what she is. He found out before you did. What he did about it is in the council record, filed under a false suppression order signed by a healer he owns. Your wolf is bound, not absent. The vial will help if you can find someone who knows how to use it properly. I left it with the letter because I didn't know who would find this first. You are not broken. You were made inconvenient. There is a difference. The deed is yours. The land is yours. Make him answer for it. Mama Josie folded the letter with great care. She did not cry. She sat for a very long time in the candlelight, with the documents arranged in front of her, and the vial beside them, and the spade leaning against the wall with its cargo of dried creek soil. And she thought about her mother sitting at a dressing table that smelled of lavender, aware that the man downstairs had poisoned her, writing letters to a daughter who was 4 years old and would not be able to read them for years. She thought about what it cost to be that composed in the face of that particular knowledge. She thought she understood now where her own stillness came from. She was outside before she fully decided to be. She didn't know what pulled her. Not the letter. Not the wolf that may or may not have been stirring in her chest since last night. Not the cold or the dark or any nameable impulse. She simply found herself standing on the small patch of bare ground in front of the trailer, still in her coat, the candle left burning inside, looking at the tree line. There was something there, not threat, not movement, presence, the particular quality of stillness that belongs to a living thing that is being very deliberate about not moving. She should have gone back inside. She didn't. I know you're there, she said, which was possibly the least strategic thing she had ever done. And she had signed a lease on a rotting trailer for Pennies, so the bar was not high. Nothing answered. Then the trees shifted, and it was not wind, and what stepped out of the dark was large enough that her body registered it before her mind did. A wolf, not in form, not shifted, but the size of it, the quality of stillness it carried. The way it moved into the edge of the lamplight from the trailer window without any of the hesitation that should accompany an animal approaching a stranger. It was the largest wolf she had ever seen. Black, mostly, with a gray cast along the shoulders that the moonlight picked out in silver. Eyes that caught the light and held it. Not the flat reflection of animal eyes, but something with depth behind it. Something that looked at her and knew it was looking. Her wolf lurched. Not a stirring this time. A lurch. A sudden violent movement like something waking in shock. Like something that had been restrained for years, recognizing what stood in front of it and reacting with a ferocity that stole Josie's breath entirely. She pressed a hand to her sternum. And the wolf inside her, her wolf, present, there, undeniably there, pressed back against her palm from the inside. The black wolf did not move. It watched her with those impossible eyes, and it waited, with the particular patience of something that has been waiting for a long time already, and knows how to do it without distress. Josie stood in the cold and breathed shallowly, which was all she could manage, and looked back. In the morning she would find the wolf gone. She would also find at the edge of the tree line where it had stood a single object, placed with evident intention on the flat top of a stone. A small carved disc of dark wood no larger than her thumb, bearing a mark she recognized from the documents she had just read. The seal of the high seat. She carried the carved disc to Marta before the morning crowd arrived. She set it on the workbench without preamble and watched the old woman's face do something complicated, a sequence of expressions moving through recognition, calculation, and a particular brand of controlled alarm that Marta wore the way other people wore reading spectacles, functionally and without apology. Where did you find this? It was not a question. Left at the tree line last night. Josie kept her voice even, clear as throat, by a wolf, the largest I've ever seen. Marta picked up the disc and turned it twice between her fingers, examining the seal with the attention she usually reserved for identifying herb samples of uncertain provenance. Then, she set it down and looked at Josie with an expression that had moved past alarm into something quieter and more serious. You understand what this mark means. High seat jurisdiction. Josie had spent the hours before dawn with the documents spread across the trailer floor, cross-referencing the seal on the deed against the disc, until she was certain. Someone from the Alpha King's court has been on this land. Not someone. Marta lowered herself onto her stool with the deliberateness of a woman whose knees were conducting a separate and ongoing negotiation with the rest of her body. The disc is a scout marker. The high seat uses them to signal that a location has been assessed and flagged for follow-up. They're not left by ordinary court writers. She paused. They're left by the king's direct retinue, or by the king himself, the trailer. The rotting, mildewed, tilted floor trailer at the edge of pack territory that Josie had rented for Pennies because there was nowhere else to go. She thought about the landlord sliding the key across the table without meeting her eyes. How long has someone been watching that land? She said. I don't know. But I suspect Marta started again more carefully. There have been rumors for 2 years that the High Seat has been conducting quiet assessments of contested border territories. Not publicly, not through the council channels, directly, privately without notifying the local packs. She looked at the disc again. If your mother's deed registers that land under High Seat jurisdiction and Edmund has been holding it fraudulently, then the Alpha King's Court has a direct interest in the matter. An independent interest, separate from mine, parallel to yours, which could be useful. Marta met her eyes, or complicated. Josie thought about the wolf at the tree line, the eyes that held light, the absolute stillness of something that was entirely in control of itself and knew it. Her wolf had lurched. She was not going to think about what that meant yet. I need to get to the High Seat, she said, with the documents before Edmund finds out they exist. And how do you propose to manage that? You have no pack standing, no escort, no letter of introduction that hasn't been filtered through Ashford Council. Marta's tone was not discouraging. It was the voice of someone helping map actual terrain. The High Seat doesn't receive unaffiliated Omegas off the road. I know. Josie folded her hands on the workbench. But if someone from the king's retinue has already been on that land, if they left that marker, then they're not unaware of what's here. Which means there may already be a channel open that doesn't run through the council. Marta was quiet for a moment. You're going to go back to the trailer, she said slowly, and wait for whoever left that disc to make contact. They've been watching the land for at least a night that I know of, possibly longer. Josie picked up the disc and closed her fingers around it. They left this after I found the documents. That's not coincidence. That's communication. She went back and she waited. She spent the day in the trailer doing the ordinary things. Mended a tear in her second wool skirt, reorganized the small collection of supplies on the shelf above the sink, boiled water for the lentils she'd been rationing through the week. She kept the documents wrapped in the oilcloth and tucked inside her coat, as if Edmund might materialize through the rotted walls at any moment. Which was irrational, and also felt entirely reasonable given everything she now knew about him. Her wolf moved through the day in small intermittent pulses, not the full presence of a manifest wolf spirit, not the warm, steady second heartbeat she'd watched other wolves carry through their lives, but something, a signal, a system rebooting after years of enforced silence. It was uncomfortable in the specific way that feeling returns to a numbed limb, sharp and disorienting and proof of something being restored. She did not open the vial. She was not ready to open the vial without knowing more about what it contained. The knock came at dusk. 3 precise raps, not tentative, not demanding. The knock of someone who was certain they had the right door and was giving the occupant the courtesy of a moment's warning before proceeding. Josie crossed to the door and opened it and looked at the man standing in the failing light outside her trailer. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of density that came not from display but from actual use. A body that had carried weight and moved fast and done both for long enough that it had simply become the shape of him. Dark hair close cut at the sides, a jaw that looked like it had been put together with strong opinions. He wore a traveling coat of dark wool, no insignia visible, rode dusty at the hem with the collar turned up against the evening cold. He held nothing in his hands. His hands were at his sides, open, which she noticed because it was deliberate. A man who understood that open hands communicated something specific to someone who had reason to be afraid. He was not what she'd expected. She had expected a court writer, a functionary, someone with scroll work on their collar and a letter of introduction and the practiced blankness of official business. This man looked at her with gray eyes that caught the last of the daylight and held it. And something in the quality of his attention, clear as throat, complete, unhurried, specific, made her wolf go very still in her chest, the way a compass needle stills when it finds true north. She stepped back from the door without inviting him in. Old instinct. Smart instinct. You left the disc, she said. Yes. His voice was low, even, no performance in it. How long have you been on this land? He considered the question with what appeared to be genuine respect for its directness. 4 nights. Watching me. Assessing the territory. You were part of what I found. She studied him. He did not shift under her study, did not adjust his expression or his posture to make it easier for her. He simply stood in the dusk outside her tilted, rotting, temporary home and waited. With the same quality of patience she had seen in the black wolf at the tree, the wolf last night, she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile exactly. The acknowledgement of one held back. Yes. Her wolf pressed hard against her ribs from the inside. Come in, she said. Which was possibly the second least strategic thing she had ever done. But you should know I have a spade. He stepped inside without comment, assessed the space in a single unhurried sweep, and did not remark on any of it. Not the linoleum or the tilted chair or the brown-stained sink or the single beeswax candle that was doing more emotional work than any candle should be asked to do. He sat when she gestured at the floor, which was all she had to offer, and sat without complaint. His back against the wall. His long legs folded, looking perfectly composed in a way that should have been absurd given the surroundings and somehow wasn't. She remained standing. She showed him the documents. He read them with the focus of someone who reads carefully not because they're slow, but because they understand that words have consequences and consequences deserve attention. When he reached the council record with the false suppression order, his expression changed. Not dramatically. Not a flinch, but a tightening around the eyes. A quality of stillness that sharpened into something colder. The healer's signature, he said. Doran, you recognize it. Doran has appeared in 3 other fraudulent suppression filings in border territories in the last 4 years. He set the document down with care. We've been trying to trace the source of the orders. This, he gestured at the papers, is the first time we have the origin point. Edmund Voss. Edmund Voss. He said the name the way you say a location on a map, neutral, precise, marking it for future navigation. Pack Elder, Ashford Territory, with connections to at least 2 council members at the regional level and 1 appointed assessor at the High Seat's land office. Josie felt something cold move through her. He is someone inside the High Seat. We removed the assessor 6 weeks ago. His gray eyes moved to hers. That's partly why I'm here. The removal opened a thread we've been following. Your land is the end of it. She looked at him for a long moment, at the traveling coat and the open hands and the composed face and the gray eyes that had looked at her from a wolf's face last night at the tree line. Who are you? She said. Not who do you work for, not what is your title. Who are you? He met her gaze without evasion. Orion, he said, and I think you already know the rest. She did. She didn't want to. She sat down on the floor across from him with the documents between them like a treaty neither of them had signed yet. And her wolf pressed steady and insistent against her ribs. And outside the pines moved in the dark and she breathed carefully and said nothing for a long moment because some truths need a breath of space before you let them in. The Alpha King was sitting on her floor. He had come to her. He had found her in the ruins, and he had waited, and he had come to her door with open hands. She was not ready to know what to do with that. Start from the beginning, she said finally. Tell me everything you know about my mother's land. He did. He talked for a long time. Not the way men talk when they want to impress. Not with volume or flourish or the particular performance of authority that she had watched Edmund deploy at every Sunday table for 14 years. That smooth, unhurried certainty that was less about truth and more about occupying space until truth felt unnecessary. Orion talked the way someone talks when they have information that belongs to another person, and they understand that the transfer of it is a debt being paid, not a favor being extended. He told her that the borderland had been flagged by the High Seat's Geographic Office 11 years ago, when a routine survey of contested corridor territories identified the creek land as a natural junction point between 3 pack boundaries that were slowly shifting under population pressure. That the land's deed, filed under Clara Rain before her marriage, had surfaced in the High Seat's archive as an anomaly. Privately held, not pack claimed, registered under a name that subsequent records showed had become Clara Voss. That the inquiry into the deed had been quietly buried inside the High Seat's land office 3 years later by the assessor they had since removed. Edmund had been protecting his position for a very long time. He told her about Doran, the healer, the false suppression orders, the pattern of omegas in border territories whose wolves had been bound by fraudulent council filings that reclassified natural gifts as liabilities, as deficiencies, as conditions requiring management. 7 cases in 4 years. Josie was the 8th. 7 others. She sat with that for a moment. 7 other women who had been made to believe themselves broken. The vial, she said. Orion reached into the inner pocket of his traveling coat and produced a small leather pouch, which he set between them without drama. Inside were 3 items. A folded paper of instructions written in a healer's shorthand, a second vial identical to the one from the hollow wall, and a small flat stone etched with a release symbol she recognized from the apothecary's reference texts. The preparation your mother left is a partial binding solvent, he said. It disrupts the chemical compound used in the suppression, but it needs to be administered alongside the release symbol and a stabilizing presence. He paused. Your wolf has already begun responding. I noticed it last night. She noticed you, Josie said, which was more honest than she intended. Something in his expression shifted. Not triumphant. Nothing like that. Something quieter and more careful. The expression of a man who understood what it meant that her wolf had recognized his and was being deliberate about not making more of it than she was ready for. The bond, she said flatly, because she was not going to circle it. Yes, I'm not discussing that tonight, I know. No argument, no persuasion. Simply, I know. And then he moved on because he was apparently a man who understood that some doors needed to be approached from a distance before they could be opened. She respected that more than she wanted to. They worked through the documents until the candle burned low, building the case with the careful architecture of people who understood that what they were constructing needed to be unassailable. Orion had a precise, organized mind. He saw connections between the papers that she had not yet reached. Cross-referenced the boundary surveys against the council record in a way that demonstrated the fraud, not just in substance, but in chronology, showing that Edmund had known the deed existed before he began courting Clara. That every step of the marriage and the estate management and the suppression filing and the blocked appeal had been sequential and intentional. Not opportunism. Design. The distinction mattered for what came next. The High Seat can convene an emergency land tribunal, Orion said. Given the involvement of a court-level assessor in the suppression of evidence, I have grounds to remove the case entirely from Ashford Council jurisdiction. Edmund cannot block or delay a High Seat tribunal. He'll know it's coming. Yes, which means we move quickly. His gray eyes were steady. I can have a formal summons issued within 2 days. Edmund will be required to appear before the tribunal within 10 days of receipt. He cannot refuse a royal summons without forfeiting his pack standing entirely. Josie thought about Edmund receiving that summons, about the expression on his face. That face she had watched perform grief and concern and paternal warmth for years, performing now in front of something it couldn't charm its way through. She thought about her mother writing letters with a failing hand. There's something else, she said. She had been sitting with it since she read Clara's second letter. Had been turning it over all day like a stone she wasn't sure she wanted to look under. Nora, she said, my mother's companion. She disappeared after the funeral. Edmund said she was let go. She met Orion's eyes. I don't think she was let go. A pause, deliberate, and it told her something. We found a woman matching that description 18 months ago, he said carefully, in a work settlement on the eastern border. Settlements that house people Edmund Voss has had placed there through fraudulent vagrancy filings over the past decade. He held her gaze. She's alive, Josie. The name, said plainly, without title or qualifier, landed differently than she expected. She had not given him permission to use it, and she did not correct him because it would have been dishonest, and she was tired of dishonesty in all its forms. She's alive, Josie repeated. She's been trying to send word for years. Every channel was blocked. His voice was even but not cold. The controlled warmth of someone who understood they were delivering something enormous and was holding it carefully. When we removed the assessor, we found a file. Her name was in it. Josie pressed both hands flat against the linoleum floor. Breathed, Nora was alive. Nora, who had known, who had helped her mother hide the documents, who had disappeared, and who Josie had quietly, guiltily grieved as another loss in a list of losses that had grown so long she'd stopped counting. She had been put somewhere Edmund could keep her silent. Get her out, Josie said before the tribunal. I want her there, already arranged. He said it simply, without making a performance of it. It was done because it needed to be done, and he had done it, and that was all. She looked at him in the low candlelight. This man who had sat on her floor for hours without complaint, who had read her mother's letters with appropriate gravity, who had said already arranged about the rescue of a woman she loved, as if competence in service of justice were simply the minimum expected of himself. She thought about Edmund, who had held her hand at healers' consultations with an expression of practiced sorrow. She thought about the difference. It not a subtle difference. The tribunal convened 12 days later in the High Seats Regional Hall, 3 territories north of Ashford, in a chamber with high stone walls and windows that let in the flat gray light of a November morning. Edmund arrived with 2 council members and an advocate, and the particular composure of a man who has survived difficult situations before by controlling who was in the room. He looked at Josie across the chamber floor, and his expression did something she had never seen it do before. A flicker, quickly suppressed, of genuine uncertainty, because she was not alone. Because she was standing beside a man whose presence in the room changed the architecture of every power calculation Edmund had ever made. Because Nora was there. Nora, who was thinner than Josie remembered, and had gray in her hair that hadn't been there before, stood 3ft to Josie's left with the particular posture of a woman who has been waiting 18 months to say something and has organized it carefully. When her eyes found Josie's, something moved across her face, recognition, relief, clears throat grief, love, all of it at once undisguised. And Josie crossed the distance between them without caring who was watching and held her briefly and fiercely, the way you hold someone when the fact of their existence has been a question for too long. I kept the copy. Nora said quietly against her hair. The letter your mother wrote me. I kept it the whole time. I know, Josie said. I know you did. The tribunal lasted 3 days. The documents were entered. Nora testified. The healer Doran, brought under royal summons and facing criminal charges independent of the tribunal, provided a deposition that confirmed the suppression order had been filed at Edmund's instruction. and that the compound used to bind Josie's wolf had been administered without her knowledge in a medicinal preparation she had been given at 17 during what she had believed was a routine wellness consultation. Edmund's advocate argued procedural objections for the entirety of the first day. On the second day, the boundary survey evidence was presented. On the third, the tribunal's 3 presiding judges delivered their findings in the flat, precise language of people who had been doing this for a long time and had no patience for ambiguity. The land was Josie's. The estate was Josie's. The fraudulent seizure was confirmed. Edmund Voss was stripped of his pack elder status, removed from all council positions, and remanded to high seat custody pending criminal proceedings related to the suppression filings, the false vagrancy charges against Nora, and the administration of a binding compound without consent. The 2 council members who had signed the blocked appeal were censured and suspended. It was not a dramatic pronouncement. It was a verdict read aloud in a stone chamber on a gray November morning, and it was enough. Josie stood and listened to it and felt the thing behind her sternum, the dense, hardened grief she had been carrying since autumn, the compressed weight of 3 months of survival, release in a long, slow exhale that she felt all the way to her hands. Her wolf rose at the same moment, fully, finally, a warm and luminous presence that settled alongside her own consciousness, like a door opening into a room that had always been there. And she pressed a hand to her sternum and felt the wolf press back. And for the first time in 6 years, she did not feel like an incomplete drawing. She felt like herself. Afterward, in the corridor outside the chamber, Orion found her standing at one of the high windows watching the November sky do its flat gray work above the territory. He stood beside her, said nothing. He was good at that, at presence without demand, at being near without requiring anything of the nearness. The land, she said eventually, what happens to it now? It's yours outright. High seat registration confirmed. He paused. What you do with it is your decision. She thought about 36 acres of pine and creek and cold earth, about a hollow and a rotted wall that had held her mother's voice for 22 years, about a tilted trailer that smelled of mildew and someone else's cigarettes where she had sat on cold linoleum and planned with the fury of someone who had just discovered the difference between being lost and being hidden. I'm going to rebuild it, she said. The land properly? I know. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with those gray eyes that caught light and held it. And the bond between them was present and real, and had been present and real since the night he stepped out of the tree line and her wolf had lurched against her ribs like something coming home. She had been carrying the weight of a word, mate, that had been made ugly by context, by a world where bonds were used as leverage, where love was performed as cover for theft, where the people who said, I'm here, were the ones you most needed to run from. Orion had not said, I'm here. He had simply been here, consistently, quietly, at every point where it mattered. There was a difference between destiny and choice. She had decided that was the difference that counted. I'm not ready for everything. She said, clear and honest because she was done with anything less. I know that too, but I'm not running from this. He was quiet for a moment. Then with the same unhurried steadiness that had characterized every interaction since he knocked on her door with open hands, that's enough. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than she had believed herself capable of offering 3 months ago when she had signed a damp paper for a rotted trailer and told herself it was temporary. The trailer was demolished in early spring. Nora came to stay in the small stone cottage Josie had built at the edge of the creek land, while the larger structure was still being framed. The cottage smelled of fresh pine and beeswax candles, and the dried lavender that Nora hung in every room because it was what Clara had always kept, and some habits were a form of loyalty. They spent the evenings at a small table by the fire talking through the years that had been taken from them, the way you talk when the loss has been named, and what remains is not grief but inventory, making sure nothing important goes unaccounted for. Edmund stood trial the following winter. He was convicted on 4 counts, stripped of his remaining assets, and exiled from PAC territory permanently. The 2 censured council members resigned their positions. Doran lost his healer's license and was barred from practice in all high seat territories. The 6 other Omegas whose wolves had been bound by his fraudulent filings were identified, treated, and restored. All 6 wolves came back. Orion and Josie were bonded formally in the first warm days of the following spring in a ceremony held on the creek land attended by Nora and Marta, and a small number of people who had earned the right to be there. There were no Sunday dinner tables with performed warmth. There were no hands held in healers' offices by someone who meant harm. There was simply Orion standing in the particular spring light of a morning that smelled of pine resin and new grass, and the creek running cold and clear nearby looking at Josie with gray eyes that had and had not looked away since. She was not a woman who had survived and recovered. She was a woman who had been hidden and had found her way back to herself, and had made something real from the ruins of what was taken. She was the owner of 36 acres of borderland that her mother had registered in her maiden name as an act of foresight and love. She was the daughter of Clara Rain, who had been right about almost everything and had made sure the truth outlasted her. She was the wolf who had been bound and was not bound anymore. The woman who had rented a rotting trailer for Pennies because there was nowhere else to go and had found beneath its floor and behind its walls everything she needed to come back. She was Josie, and she had come home.